Now we get into chapter 3, which starts to talk about probably everybody's favorite part of kinesiology, muscles. So in the book, in the little introduction of the chapter, it talks about how in physical rehabilitation programs, a lot of times we're working in stretching, strengthening, and retraining of muscles. Because muscles are, number one, they're the only part of our body that produces active force, and number two, they're sort of easily addressed, easily changed. The muscles have to receive input from the nervous system, and certainly next winter in neuro we'll be talking way more about that, talking about our upper motor neurons and our lower motor neurons and all sorts of crazy stuff. And we'll also review some of the stuff that we've gone through in this class, so remember it. Well, you'll want to remember everything, of course. So muscles are the sole producer of active force in the body. That's how we move. That's how we do things. They can also act as stabilizers for joints. So if you have a ligament injury, a lot of times in physical therapy, exercises you do aren't going to do anything to change your ligament, but you can help train the muscles in the area to stabilize that joint. So the nervous system sends the message, the muscle contracts and pulls on the bone to create movement. And this happens so fast. When the muscle is contracted, the freest or less constrained segment moves. So in the picture here, the person on the left, their freest segment is the distal segment, so the quadriceps contract and they get that knee extension, open chain knee extension. In the second picture, the distal segment is more fixed, and so the knee extension makes her stand up, do a sit to stand. So we will talk a lot about functional movements in lab, and we'll do functional movement analyses to say, well, what happens when we contract those muscles? And more to the point, probably, why do we care? So you should ask yourself, really, every time you're listening to a lecture or reading the chapter is, why do I need to know this? What's important about this? How does this connect to other things that I know? So we're asking ourselves these questions all the time. We're going to review the 3 types of muscular activation. I'm sure you all heard this in anatomy and physiology and probably other places as well. And we're going to talk a lot about this with all the muscles that we think about in this class. So a concentric muscle contraction is a shortening or contracting action. The muscle produces active force and simultaneously shortens. An eccentric motion is attempting to resist elongation. The muscle attempts to contract, but it's pulled to a longer length by a dominant external force like gravity. Gravity is a big player in eccentric muscle contractions. Isometric muscular activation, the muscle generates active force while remaining at a constant length. So if you're holding a stack of books and walking down the hall, your muscles have to activate isometrically to hold on to those books and not drop them on the floor. If you do start to drop them, they're pulling down, well, they have to activate eccentrically to slow down that pull of gravity. And then when you have to lift them and put them up on a shelf, then the muscles have to contract concentrically in order to overcome gravity. So a lot of it, we will talk about a lot of things with relationship to gravity, and whether gravity or muscle is the force producing the action. So we'll do a lot of that in lab, and we'll do some of it in lecture as well. So again, this is a review. We've already talked about it in the last module, and I'm sure in other points in your life you've heard this too. So proximal and distal attachments, we're talking about relative points of muscle to bone attachments. The proximal attachment, also known as the origin, is the point of attachment closest to the midline or core of the body in the anatomical position. So The distal attachment or the insertion is the point of attachment farthest from the midline or the core of the body. So that just redefining those words. This concept of agonists and antagonists might be new to you, or maybe you've heard it before. But the agonist is the muscle or muscle group that's most directly related to performing a specific movement. So when in the picture in the previous slide where we're doing quadriceps contraction, the quadriceps were the agonists for knee extension. The antagonist is the muscle or muscle group that can oppose the action of the agonist. So for knee extension, where the quadriceps are the agonist, the hamstrings or other knee flexors are the antagonist. The example that I have here, during elbow flexion, the biceps are the agonists and the triceps are the antagonists. So when you're doing a concentric contraction of the agonist, the antagonist has to passively elongate in order to give you the full range of motion at your joint. So the antagonist isn't doing anything. It's not doing the opposite action. It's not helping with the action because, remember, muscles can't push. They can only pull. And it's not pulling in the opposite direction, otherwise you get a different type of motion. But it's actually passively along for the ride, just elongating as the opposite muscle contracts. So we'll talk about how muscles work together. A co-contraction is when agonist and antagonist muscles are simultaneously isometrically activated. So I think of this as you're standing on the bus because there aren't any seats and the bus is stopping, so you have to fight against the action of the brakes. And all your muscles in your lower extremities have to contract to keep you stabilized. So co-contraction is often a stabilizing collaboration between the agonist and antagonist muscles. You can think of it that way. Or if you're doing some really tiny little fine motor skill, like maybe you're engraving or something like that, a lot of the muscles in your upper extremity are contracting to stabilize so you can make those precision movements. So co-contraction is often a stabilizing contraction. A muscle could also be thought of as a stabilizer, where one muscle holds a body segment relatively stationary so that another muscle can more effectively perform. So for those of you that are personal trainers or athletic trainers, or Pilates teachers or yoga teachers, or just people who work out on a regular basis, hopefully we all are, you know that sometimes you're doing a motion, like maybe I'm going to do some bent over rows, and I really want to stabilize my shoulder girdle so then I can make it a more precise motion. Our shoulder girdle muscles are acting as stabilizers, so then our other muscles can perform that action. Synergists are muscles that work together to perform a particular action. So in the bent over row, your biceps and your latissimus dorsi are acting as synergists to perform that action a lot of times, and maybe a few other muscles. So a force couple is a specific type of synergistic action. Muscles in a force couple, they produce force in different linear directions, but they produce torque in the same rotary direction. So there are parts of our body that do those rotary motions. The scapula is a big one of them. When we elevate our arm, the scapula has to upwardly rotate in order to basically get the acromion process out of the way. And so we have the upper trapezius, the lower trapezius, and the serratus anterior that act as that force couple to produce torque in the rotary direction to do that upward rotation on the scapula. So we have other force couples, and we'll talk about the individual ones when we're talking about individual joints, but it's a specific type of synergistic muscle action. When we refer to muscle excursion, it's the amount of shortening or lengthening that a muscle goes through. So typically a muscle can only shorten or elongate about half its resting length. So let's just say something is 10 inches long at its resting length. I'm just making that number up. So it can probably only elongate to about 15 inches long or shorten to about 5 inches long. Does that make sense? Okay, I hope it does. Ask yourself, does that make sense? Or is Loretta just telling me a story? Okay, so now we're going to go, we're going to get our little microscopes on, and we're going to go into the functional components of skeletal muscle. And we're going to start big and work our way down small. So the muscle belly is the body of the muscle. If you like reach over right now, do it. Reach over, grab your bicep, the belly of the muscle, just that body of the muscle. And it's composed of bundles of fasciculi. And the epimysium surrounds the belly of the muscle and helps to hold the muscle shape. So our muscles are surrounded and encased, and we have connective tissue inside. There's connective tissue within and around and throughout all of our muscles, and those are contiguous with the tendons and the periosteum. So we talk about all these different structures, but really they're quite attached in the body. They're pretty contiguous. And if you ever get a chance to take a cadaver anatomy class, you'll see how much connective tissue there is holding us together and giving shape to our body. So I have a few cadaver anatomy pictures in different PowerPoints, and you'll see all that connective tissue. In the last chapter, we had that one of the joint capsule, and you could see how much connective tissue was around that. But the part of the connective tissue that surrounds the belly of the muscle, we call the epimysium. A fasciculus, which the number of them together form the muscle belly, it's a bundle of muscle fibers. And each fasciculus is surrounded by the perimysium. It surrounds and supports an individual fasciculus, and it serves as a vehicle to support nerves and blood vessels. So muscles need a good blood supply. And they have it, and that's one of the reasons why they're red, and it's also the reason why they heal so well. So you constantly need an influx of oxygen to work those muscles, to do the aerobic respiration and make ATP to power our muscle contractions. So we need to have a vehicle to support those nerves and blood vessels. We also need input from the nervous system to give us those nervous impulses that are going to give us a muscular contraction. So there's got to be a road for those vehicles to drive on. So the muscle fiber is an individual muscle cell. It has multiple nuclei. Hopefully in A&P you got to look at some under the microscope. It contains all the contractile elements within the muscle. So even though we have all that connective tissue, the connective tissue doesn't contract. The blood vessels and nerves don't contract. The tendons don't contract. But the individual muscle fibers, those contain the contractile elements within the muscles. Within the muscle fibers, we have the endomysium. It's the collagen fibril meshwork surrounding each muscle fiber, and it helps transfer that contractile force to the tendon. So those connective tissues around and within and just throughout the muscle are what are transferring the contractile force to the tendon. So a myofibril is the little part that composes the muscle fiber, and it contains the contractile proteins packaged within sarcomeres. So the sarcomere is the basic contractile unit of muscle fiber. So we have tons of these little guys, end on end, lining up into that muscle fiber. The sarcomeres are composed of actin, myosin, protein filaments, and then some other proteins that are structural, like titin and tropomyosin and some of those other ones. But we're just going to talk about actin and myosin right now. The way muscles contract, it's called the sliding filament hypothesis. Actin filaments slide past the myosin filaments, resulting in contraction of an individual sarcomere. So each little sarcomere contracts, and then all of them stacked up together are contracting, and that causes the muscle to contract, and that transmits energy to the tendon, which then moves the bone. So it all starts with that little sarcomere contracting and those little filaments sliding over one another. So actin myosin cross bridges are created when myosin filaments, which have those little heads, they're the little thing that looks like a golf club in the depiction of the sarcomere, they attach to those thinner actin filaments. The myosin head binds an actin filament, makes that cross bridge. The head flexes and produces a power stroke between the actin and myosin, causing that contraction. The actin and filament slides past the myosin, it generates force and shortens the sarcomere. So simultaneous contraction of sarcomere shortens the entire muscle. So that's our classic concentric contraction, if you want to think of it that way. So 3 factors determine the functional potential of a muscle. Like, hey, what can you do with that muscle? The cross-sectional area, in other words, bigger, fatter muscles are stronger. That totally makes sense, right? The shape of the muscle, and we'll talk about different muscle shapes, and its line of pull. So we started talking about line of pull, and we're going to keep talking about it. In fact, we're going to be talking about it all the time. So the cross-sectional muscle area, the thickness of a muscle, which is an indirect measure of the contractile elements available to generate force. So we all know that someone with bigger muscles is stronger than someone with smaller muscles, right? A person with larger muscles can usually generate larger forces because their muscles' cross-sectional area is bigger. So the bigger the cross-sectional area, the greater the force potential. So if you want to be strong, you got to build up your cross-sectional area. Shape is an important indicator of a muscle-specific action. So most muscles are one of 4 shapes, and we'll talk about each of these individual little shapes. And while we're talking about the shapes, you might think about, or even, hey, write it down. When we talk about the individual shapes, think of individual muscles and see if you know what shapes they are. And then later on, look it up and see if they really are those shapes. So just kind of dig around in your brain and see if you can figure out what shapes muscles are. Just think of, sort of brainstorm what muscles are fusiform, what are triangular, which ones are rhomboidal, and which ones are pennate. So the muscle shapes are defined by their types of attachments and the direction of the muscle fibers. So fusiform muscles, the fibers run parallel to one another. They're built to provide large ranges of motion. So that's our classic biceps brachii. It's sort of fat in the middle and pointy on the ends, if you want to think of it that way. And so they're large range of motion. We're going to contract and we're going to move stuff. Triangular muscles, they have expansive proximal attachments converging to a small distal attachment. That makes sense. They're like a little triangle. So the fiber directions, they're like a fan almost. So they provide a stabilized base for generating force. Your classic example of this is the gluteus medius. It attaches all along the iliac crest, and then all of the fibers go down into a pretty small insertion on the greater trochanter. So they're generating force because the gluteus medius is really important in our balance and our walking, that sort of thing. So I like to say all muscles are important, but some are more important than others. The gluteus medius is a muscle that is frequently addressed in a physical therapy setting. Rhomboidal muscles, expansive proximal and distal attachments. These guys are huge. They're shaped like large rhomboids or offset squares. They're really suited for stabilizing a joint or providing large forces depending on the cross-sectional area. So you can have little rhomboidal muscles that are stabilizers, or you can have big ones like the gluteus maximus. And that guy is a power muscle. If we want to get up out of a chair, if we want to accelerate, if we want to run faster, we have to have those big rhomboids working for us. Pennate muscles. They resemble the shape of a feather. The muscle fibers approach a central tendon at an oblique angle. They have large force potential but limited excursion. If you think about how those fibers go, that makes sense. The fiber's going to contract. You're not going to have a lot of excursion for the whole length of the muscle, but it's lots of force generated. There are subclassifications of pinnate muscles, bipinnate, multipinnate, and because it's based on the number of fiber sets that are attached to the central tendon. So right now, turn off this recording and write down examples that you can think of the 4 different muscle types. And then after the lecture's done, go look them up in your book and see if you were right. Okay, did you turn it off and come back? I hope you did. So line of pull. We're talking about line of pull again. Muscle forces can be described as vectors because they possess both a direction and a magnitude. The direction of a muscle's force is referred to as the line of pull or the line of force. So we talked about this in a previous chapter. We're going to talk about it in all the rest of the chapters. When we talk about muscles in every chapter after this, we're going to talk about line of pull. So the example in the picture, the muscle's line of pull that courses anterior to the medial-lateral axis of rotation of the shoulder performs flexion. And if it's posterior, it performs extension. So when we look at the individual muscles, we're going to look at the muscle and we're going to say, where is it in relationship to its axis? And then based on that, what motion does it perform? So we could think of the anterior deltoid as an example of a muscle that courses anteriorly to the medial lateral axis of the shoulder, and it performs shoulder flexion. The posterior deltoid, posterior to the medial lateral axis, performs extension.